They came from the desert. No homeland, no allies, just a prophecy, an eagle, a cactus, and a dream. Long before Mexico City stood where it does now, before the Spanish arrived with steel and greed, there was a people called the Mexica. They were outcasts, mocked by kings, forced to eat snakes, to sleep in swamps, to live on the edge of extinction. And yet, they built one of the most powerful empires the Americas had ever seen. Stone by stone, god by god, sacrifice by sacrifice. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, rose like a vision from a dream, floating on water, connected by causeways, adorned with golden temples and crimson altars. They ruled with brilliance and with blood. But just as their empire reached the heavens, a shadow appeared on the shore. Foreign sails, steel armor, horses. What followed was not just war, it was a collision of worlds. And it would end in fire, disease, betrayal, and silence. This isn't just history, it's a mirror, a story of power built from nothing, and how fast it can all vanish. You've heard of Rome, you've heard of Egypt, but the story of the Aztecs? That's the empire the world forgot, and the one you're about to remember. So before we judge their gods, their rituals, or the ashes they left behind, let's walk their temples, hear their story, and if this journey moves you, subscribe, like, and keep the fire of history burning, because this is the rise and fall of the Aztecs. Darkness had fallen over the Valley of Mexico. The great Toltec Empire, once a beacon of civilization, had crumbled. Its temples stood empty, its gods silenced, the cities abandoned to time and dust. Out of the ashes came the Mexica. They were not kings, not builders, not even welcome. They were wanderers, poor, ragged, and despised. Other tribes called them savages, rude, bloodthirsty, crude imitators of the greatness that had come before. But the Mexica had something the others did not. A voice in the dark, a god, Huitzilopochtli, whispering through dreams, speaking through firelight. He promised them a home, a land of destiny, but not yet. They wandered for generations, across dry plains, through forests, over mountains. No city welcomed them, no ruler offered shelter, so they lived on the edge eating snakes, rats, and roots, worshipping borrowed gods, learning to survive without being seen. At night, they told each other a story, prophecy, that one day they would see a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. And where they saw that sign, they would stop and build a city no one could tear down. But for now, they had no city, only hope. Time passed. The world moved on. Great powers rose, Texcoco, Tlacopan, Culhuacan, and still the Mexica wandered, landless, leaderless, unloved. But they listened to the god. Every defeat became a lesson, every exile a test. Their skin grew tougher, their spirits sharper, their faith deeper. They were not yet Aztec, not yet empire builders, but they were becoming something, forged in hunger, shaped in rejection, bound together by the shared dream of a home. By 1200, they were still homeless, still watching, still waiting, but the dream had not died. It pulsed beneath their skin like fire, and in the silence, their god still spoke. "Walk," he whispered. "Endure. The sign is coming." And so they did, not knowing that just beyond the mist, in the swamps of a lake yet unnamed, destiny was waiting. The road was long and cruel, but still the Mexica walked, through canyons veiled in mist, across thorny hills and sacred lakes, not to conquer, not to rest, but to find the sign their god had promised. An eagle, cactus, a serpent. Some laughed at the tale, others spat at them, but the Mexica believed, and that belief burned brighter than their hunger. They wandered the valley of Mexico like ghosts, unwanted, hunted, mocked by the children of stronger tribes. Culhuacan, a city of kings, a land of golden thrones and ancient bloodlines. The Mexica begged for a place there, not as equals, but as servants. They became mercenaries, fighters for hire, butchers in someone else's war. For a moment it worked. They won battles, proved their worth, even married into the royal line. But pride is poison. When the Mexica sacrificed a princess in honor of Huitzilopochtli, the king of Culhuacan flew into a rage. The illusion shattered. The alliance collapsed. The Mexica were chased like dogs into the swamps of Chapultepec. There, they tried again, built shelters from reeds, carved homes into rock. But peace never stayed long. Enemies came with spears and fire. Chapultepec fell. The Mexica were captured, their leaders dragged to temple altars, their hearts offered to foreign gods. It was the lowest point. The dream seemed dead. They had followed the god and been led to ruin. But still, they did not break. In prison, they whispered prayers. In exile, they watched the sky, waiting, hoping. And one dawn, it happened. A shimmer on the lake, a glint of feathers, a cry from above. There, on a small, muddy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, an eagle perched on a cactus, a serpent in its beak. The sign. Tears fell. Hands trembled. This was it. The prophecy made flesh. No one else wanted the land. It was swampy, disease-ridden, unlivable. But the Mexica didn't care. This place, this cursed patch of mud and reeds, was theirs. Promise fulfilled. A new beginning. They planted their spears in the muck, built temples from mud, lit fires to the god who had never left them. This was not a kingdom, not yet, only the shadow of a city. But it had a name now, Tenochtitlan. The place has been found, but to make it a city, they will have to bleed for every stone. Lake Texcoco, 13th 25 CE. The sun rose, pale and uncertain, over the mirror-still waters of Lake Texcoco. From the mist, canoes drifted forward, silent shadows carrying a broken people, mud-streaked faces, empty stomachs, eyes that had seen too much. The Mexica had wandered for centuries, always moving, never home. Their priests murmured old prophecies. Their warriors clutched spears not for war, but survival. Children slept in reed baskets. Mothers wept into the lake. And still they searched. A cry echoed from the lead canoe. The paddle stopped mid-air. All eyes turned. There, rising from a jagged stone at the heart of a small swampy island, stood an eagle. Its wings spread wide. Its feathers glowed gold beneath the dawn. In its talons a serpent writhed, and beneath its claws, a prickly pear cactus bloomed from the rock itself. The omen, the sign, the promise. Centuries of oral prophecy had spoken of it. Where the eagle eats the snake upon the cactus, there shall you build your home. It was here, this wasteland of reeds and mud, this forgotten island, this unwanted land. It was sacred. The people fell to their knees. Tears mixed with the lake water. Some whispered, others wept. A few stood frozen in awe. This was no accident, no coincidence. This was a message from Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, their protector, their fire. He had spoken through the world, not in thunder, not in voice, but in sign, and the Mexica understood. They did not see swamp. They saw destiny. They did not feel the hunger. They felt the prophecy alive in their bones. And with trembling hands, they stepped ashore. Here they would begin, not because the land welcomed them, but because the gods had chosen it. By nightfall, they built small shelters from reeds. The island quaked under their footsteps, wet, cold, unforgiving, but every soul slept with new purpose, not comfort, but belonging. The Mexica had been a people without a land. Now, they were a land with a prophecy, and that changes everything. But visions fade, and omens do not build cities. What comes next is struggle. What comes next is pain. The gods had given a sign, but not a solution. In Tenochtitlan, 13th 25 CE, a bird on a cactus, a snake in its beak. The gods had spoken, but they had not made it easy. The promised land was not gold. It was water, mud, salt, an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, abandoned by reason, forgotten by man, a place no one wanted, except the Mexica. They came with nothing, no horses, no wealth, no land to plow, only a sign, only a dream, only the will to survive. The lake greeted them like a curse. Swamps swallowed their footsteps. Mosquitoes drank their blood. Reeds taller than men whispered in the night. Even the sky seemed to weep here. The first shelters sank. The earth was too soft, the water too shallow. Crops rotted in brine. Children coughed in fever. Elders starved quietly, their eyes fixed on the horizon. One by one, the weak began to die. And still, they stayed, because turning back was not an option, because no other land would have them, because the eagle had chosen. Each morning, the priests burned copal on damp altars. Each night, they looked to the stars and begged the gods for mercy. But mercy does not build nations. Pain does. So they changed. They studied the land that rejected them. They learned the tides of the lake, the rhythm of the seasons, the language of mud and root. And from the filth they created order. They wove rafts of reeds, anchored them with trees, filled them with silt, ash, and hope. Floating fields, chinampas, islands that breathed. The Mexica did not tame nature. They outsmarted it. Canals were carved like veins, crisscrossing the lake. Fish swam beneath floating gardens. Corn grew atop living rafts. Birds returned. So did color, and sound, and prayer. The swamp became soil. The mud became harvest. And the island became home. But outside the lake, the world still sneered. To the great cities, Texcoco, Tlacopan, Culhuacan, the Mexica were insects. Not kings, not neighbors, just squatters on filth. The outcasts who once ate bark and begged for work. They watched smoke rise from the island and laughed. Let them build, let them burn. But the Mexica did not burn. They grew. Each day another chinampa, another child born, another roof raised, and with each step forward, they whispered, "We are not the people you remember. We are becoming something else." Still, the wounds of the past lingered. They remembered every insult, every humiliation, every village that cast them out. The ache of exile ran deep, the memory of hunger deeper still. But here, in the land no one wanted, they began to dream dangerous dreams. Of walls, of markets, of temples carved from stone, of vengeance. They were not powerful yet, but they had time, and time, like water, reshapes everything. So the island grew, not with pride, but with persistence. They built from mud, They sowed in salt. They prayed over ashes. And the gods, perhaps surprised by their resolve, began to answer, not in words, but in maize, in rainfall, in survival. No one gave them this land. No one welcomed them. They took it. They bent it. They made it theirs. A home born in exile, a future built on pain. People once forgotten, now impossible to ignore. In Tenochtitlan, mid-1300 CE, water surrounded them, but thirst remained. Salt poisoned the lake. Algae clung to the surface like rot. The sun scorched, then vanished into storms. And still they endured, because survival is not a gift. It is a craft. The Mexica did not pray for rescue. They designed it. They sliced through the lake with obsidian blades, carved canals like a spiderweb, east to west, north to south, each channel measured, each reed counted. They studied the wind, mapped the rains, watched how the moon pulled the water like breath. Then they built barriers, dikes, massive sloping walls of mud and stone, to separate the brine from the fresh, to control what once controlled them. It was not enough to survive. They had to command the elements. They planted maize, squash, beans, but not in rows. They staggered them, layered them, let each root feed the next. The Chinampas pulsed with green, and in that green, a revolution. Imagine it, a floating city, gardens rising from water, frogs croaking under the shadows of maize stalks, priests gliding in canoes between temple fires and morning chants. It was not yet an empire, but it was no longer a settlement. It was an idea. Stone by stone they built upward. Causeways rose from the lake like arms. 3 great roads stretched to the mainland, solid, straight, sacred. Each one a statement. We are here. We are many. We will not be forgotten. By day, workers hauled rock. By night, priests whispered omens into the stars. The calendar spun. The gods waited. And in the shadows of the temples, warriors trained. Because survival was never enough. Because hunger never leaves a people, it transforms into fire. But not all threats came from the gods. Floods returned. Walls broke. Fields drowned. Children cried. Fathers cursed the sky. Yet the Mexica rebuilt. Every time. They did not bend. They adapted. They built aqueducts to bring clean water from distant springs. Filtered it through charcoal and gravel. They crafted tools from obsidian sharp enough to split a hair. They raised markets so vast even enemies came to trade. Fish, cloth, salt, weapons, dyes, and stories. Tenochtitlan had become more than a city. It was becoming a mirror, a storm, prophecy unfolding. The world outside began to notice. The same lords who once called them dogs now sent envoys, with tribute, with curiosity, with fear. But the Mexica never forgot. Their city was not built on trust. It was built on memory, and memory sharpens like a blade. One day, the lake would no longer protect them. The causeways would not only carry goods, but armies, and so they prepared, with maps, with bloodlines, with fire. The city pulsed like a heart, and beneath the rhythm of daily life, drums beat, footsteps echoed, whispers moved like wind. The Mexica had survived the impossible. Now they would rise. In Tenochtitlan, late 1300 CE, they came in silence, painted in black, clad in jaguar skins, eyes gleaming beneath obsidian helmets. They did not speak. They did not boast. They listened to the drums, to the wind, to the gods, because before a man becomes a warrior, he becomes a shadow. The youth of Tenochtitlan trained with hunger in their stomachs. No comfort, no softness, only sweat, stone, discipline. They ran barefoot across sharp gravel until their feet bled, wrestled in the mud until bones cracked, fasted beneath the sun until visions came. This was not cruelty. This was transformation. The greatest were chosen, those who moved like cats, who struck without sound, who killed without hate. They became Ahuitzotl, jaguar warriors, not for glory, not for riches, but for balance, because the gods had given the sun, and the sun required blood. Their armor was not iron, it was myth, jaguar pelts wrapped tight to their skin, ears adorned with feathers of eagles, shields painted with moons, stars, fire. They were not just men, they were symbols, reminders that survival had a cost, and the Mexica were ready to pay it. Enemies watched from beyond the lake. They saw the city grow, but not what grew within it. They saw markets, temples, kings, but not the teeth, not the claws. Every year the warriors were tested, not in games, in war. Capture, not kill. That was the code, because blood was currency, but hearts were power. The gods desired living offerings, and the jaguar warriors hunted them. They leapt from trees, ambushed from rivers, dragged enemies alive from smoking battlefields, and returned not as killers, but as priests of sacrifice. Each captive taken was an offering, each victory a prayer. Some questioned it, the violence, the rituals, but the Mexica believed, without death there is no dawn. Without blood, the sun will not rise. This was not savagery. It was order. It was cosmic duty. The people feared the jaguar warriors, but they also worshipped them. Children carved their shapes into wood. Poets sang of their silence in the jungle. They became more than soldiers. They became memory. Yet power is a hungry beast. As the warriors rose, so did ambition. Nobles began to see themselves as gods. Sacrifice became spectacle. Captives turned from warriors to peasants. Blood flowed faster, but meaning thinned, and still the drums beat. The lake whispered warnings. The wind changed, but the city was too loud now, too proud. The Mexica had built the greatest military brotherhood the valley had seen. But beneath the jaguar's roar, the ground began to tremble. In the temples, fire danced. In the plazas, warriors marched. In the shadows, something stirred. The gods watched and waited, because warriors may rise, but so do storms. 1325 to 1400 CE. The city was alive, but not free. Tenochtitlan shimmered on the lake like a jewel, but it belonged to another hand. Azcapotzalco ruled the valley. The Tepanecs, rich, brutal, unshaken, and the Mexica were beneath them. They were called allies, but lived like slaves. Each season, the tribute left in silence. Canoes heavy with maize, feathers, cotton, obsidian. Their best warriors sent to fight another king's war. Their priests forbidden from building higher temples. And still, they obeyed, because to rebel too early is to be crushed before your bones even harden. The Tepanec king, Tezozomoc, ruled like a god. Old, wise, merciless. He saw the Mexica as useful dogs, nothing more. He let them live. He let them build. But only as long as they bowed. And they did, or seemed to. Yet beneath the silence, something stirred. In dark temples lit by fire, priests whispered of a different future. Not just survival, but dominance. In crowded markets, soldiers watched the young, measured their strength, tested their loyalty. Something was growing. Not just chinampas, something sharper. The city endured. It learned. It remembered every humiliation, every stolen offering, every word unsaid. Tenochtitlan was watching. And in the halls of Azcapotzalco, no one saw the storm coming. Not yet. They thought the Mexica were harmless. Just another tribe. Useful, desperate, tamed. But the truth was deeper, like roots spreading beneath still water. The land they had taken, marsh, sludge, salt-soaked and cursed, was slowly being turned into gold. Not with coins, but with labor, hands calloused from years of silence, planted floating gardens, chinampas, on a lake no one else wanted. And it grew. Maize, squash, flowers the color of blood. A city that fed itself, that fed others, that no longer begged. Canals crisscrossed the waters like veins. Boats moved like breath. Markets buzzed with obsidian, fish, and salt cakes. Tenochtitlan had begun to speak, not in rebellion, but in abundance. Temples rose, slow and silent, small shrines hidden behind reed walls, priests chanting in whispers, gods watching from behind stone eyes. Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and sun, was hungry, and his people were preparing, not with swords, but with stories, with fire, with memory. Children were taught more than farming. They learned to endure, to obey, to plan. The elders did not speak of war, but they no longer feared it. They waited, like seeds buried deep, knowing spring always comes. Above them, the Tepanecs ruled in gold and arrogance. Azcapotzalco danced on its throne. But below, Tenochtitlan was growing teeth. Its roots ran deep now, and they could not be pulled out. He was born in shadows, the son of a slave woman, and yet destined to reshape an empire. His name meant obsidian snake. Ahuitzotl. Hard, silent, sharp. He grew up watching the tribute canoes, watching the priests kneel to Tepanec lords, watching his people bow and break. But he did not break. He learned history first, from old men who whispered names of forgotten kings, from scrolls that told of freedom, then chains. He read what others feared to speak, and he remembered. Then he learned war, not in parades, but in mud, in blood, in hunger. He carried spears, served as a common soldier, watched friends fall to obsidian blades, for a king who didn't know their names. Inside him, fire gathered, but he hid it. He spoke little, smiled less, but his eyes, they burned with the vision of something greater. In secret, he met with priests, with builders, with the keepers of the old tongue. Together, they asked forbidden questions. What if we stop bowing? What if this lake becomes an empire? They trained harder. They mapped the valley. They studied the weaknesses of Azcapotzalco. The Mexica were no longer just surviving. They were preparing. As Tezozomoc, the old Tepanec king, began to fade, a storm gathered in the east. Ahuitzotl rose through the ranks, quietly, deliberately, not with force, but with destiny. By the time he stood before the temple steps, wrapped in jaguar skin, crowned with fire-colored feathers, his people already knew this was no servant, this was a serpent, and he was about to strike. Azcapotzalco had ruled for generations. From stone palaces, Tepanec kings watched the valley kneel. Gold flowed in, tribute piled high, and the Mexica remained quiet, too quiet. But time, like water, wears down even mountains. And Tezozomoc, the mighty lion of the Tepanecs, was dying, old, tired, paranoid. He trusted no one. not even his sons. When he finally closed his eyes, he left behind a crown soaked in suspicion. His son, Maxla, seized it with blood, not with honor, not with blessing. Maxla was cruel where Tezozomoc had been cunning, impatient where his father was wise. He ruled with fear, and fear is brittle. The Mexica had watched. They saw the cracks, the broken alliances, the silent courtiers, the growing hatred in the streets, and they moved, not loudly, not yet, but Ahuitzotl met with allies in the night. Texcoco, Tlacopan, other city-states tired of bending the knee. Old enemies became whispered friends. In the temples of Tenochtitlan, priests sharpened blades, not just for sacrifice, but for war. Drums beat deeper, shields were oiled, youths were trained. They did not speak of rebellion, but they dreamed of it. Then Maxla made a mistake. He tried to assassinate the Mexica leader. He failed, and in that failure, he lit a fire he could not extinguish. Ahuitzotl stood before his warriors, cloaked in the colors of war, face painted with ash, voice quiet as thunder. They call us slaves. Let them learn what slaves become when they rise. The old lion was dead. Tezozomoc, the king who ruled the Valley of Mexico like a storm, was gone. For half a century, Azcapotzalco had been the sun all others revolved around. Tenochtitlan bowed to him. Texcoco feared him. Every tribute, every war, every prayer passed through his hands. But time had stolen his voice, and death had stolen his crown, and into the power vacuum stepped his son, Maxla. He was not born to lead. He took the throne through blood, not right, poisoned rivals, burned scrolls, silenced voices. In his eyes there was no wisdom, only ambition. Where his father ruled through fear and strategy, Maxla ruled through hatred and suspicion. He declared himself king of Azcapotzalco, then demanded loyalty from Tenochtitlan. But Ahuitzotl, the new leader of the Mexica, was not born to kneel. Tenochtitlan sent gifts: gold, feathers, cacao. Maxla rejected them. Instead, he sent knives. First, the messengers disappeared. Then, a trusted nobleman, flayed alive in a public square. His skin hung from the gates of Azcapotzalco, a message written in blood: loyalty or death. The Mexica Council met in silence. Some urged patience, others whispered war, but Ahuitzotl stood alone and spoke softly. We have bowed for too long. Now we lift our heads, and they will see the fire in our eyes. At night, the city felt colder. Drums no longer played. The lake grew still. Spies moved between islands. Maxla's men poisoned wells. Children vanished. Merchants were murdered in their sleep. Tenochtitlan was under siege, but no war had been declared. Not yet. Then came the final insult. A gift box, delivered by canoe, wrapped in royal cloth. It was laid at the steps of the Templo Mayor. When the priests opened it, they recoiled. Inside was the heart of Chimalpopoca, a former ruler of Tenochtitlan, murdered in Maxla's palace. His heart, still warm. The people screamed. The drums returned. And for the first time in generations, Tenochtitlan stopped praying and started sharpening its blades. In the royal chamber, Ahuitzotl stood before the war captains, his voice steady, his hand on the obsidian hilt of his blade. We were their slaves. We built their roads. We carried their gold, and they tore out our hearts like we were cattle. Now we will tear out theirs. No more silence, no more tribute. Tenochtitlan would rise, but it could not do it alone. Ahuitzotl looked east, to a city once conquered, Texcoco, home of a prince in exile, a name whispered like prophecy, Nezahualcóyotl, the Wolf King, the poet warrior. He had waited years for vengeance, and the hour had come. The storm had begun, but one city alone could not bring down an empire. Tenochtitlan had fire, it had warriors, it had rage, but Azcapotzalco had numbers, allies, wealth, steel. So Ahuitzotl turned to the only man, whose hatred burned hotter than his own, Nezahualcóyotl. He had lived as a ghost for years, the rightful heir of Texcoco, forced into exile after Maxtla's father had murdered his father before his eyes. Nezahualcóyotl had fled into forests, mountains, caves, but he had not forgotten. He had memorized every name of those who betrayed him. Now he emerged from hiding, not as a fugitive, but as a king in waiting. They met by torchlight, a hidden grove on neutral ground. No drums, no banners, no glory, just three men. Ahuitzotl, the obsidian serpent of Tenochtitlan; Nezahualcóyotl, the wolf prince of Texcoco; Totoquihuatli, the calm, calculating ruler of Tlacopan. Three powers, one oath. They spoke not of conquest, but of justice, not of gold, but of blood. The pact was sealed the old way, with ritual, with sacrifice, with the offering of obsidian blades drawn across palms. Their blood dripped onto the earth. 3 hearts, 1 will, 3 cities, 1 flame. We rise or we die. They planned in secret, routes of attack, Tepanec weak points, allies hiding in plain sight, rebels buried inside Azcapotzalco's own cities. The lake would become a battlefield, and the water would turn red. Nezahualcóyotl returned to Texcoco, not as a beggar, but as a warrior. The people saw him, and they remembered. The boy who had fled in chains had returned in jaguar armor. He raised the banner of rebellion, and the city followed him. Tlacopan, the quiet third, opened its gates. They had bowed to Azcapotzalco for years, but now they saw which way the wind blew. They chose fire over silence. The alliance was complete. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, Tlacopan, 3 blades, 1 hand. In Tenochtitlan, the priest stood before the great fire. The gods had waited centuries for this moment. O Huitzilopochtli, god of war, witness your children rise. The drums began, low and slow. The warriors painted their faces. Children kissed their mothers. Obsidian knives were blessed. They would no longer serve. They would no longer beg. They would take back the world, with blood, steel, and fire. The war was no longer coming. The war had begun. The lake had gone silent, and then it screamed. War canoes sliced across the black water like shadows with teeth. Drums pounded like the hearts of gods. Torchlight danced on obsidian blades. Tenochtitlan had risen. Texcoco had returned. Tlacopan had chosen its side, and Azcapotzalco never saw it coming. Maxtla believed himself untouchable. King of kings, Lord of the valley. He still sat on the same throne his father once ruled. But the world around him had already turned to ash. Allies turned their faces. Merchants stopped their caravans. Even the wind seemed to whisper rebellion. But Maxtla, he mocked the alliance. Let the dogs bark, he said. The empire does not fear fleas. But the dogs did not bark. They bit. The first strike fell like lightning. Texcoco, from the east, marched on Tepanecs strongholds. They razed outposts and took prisoners. Nezahualcóyotl personally led the charge. His spear dipped in the blood of his father's murderers. From the west, Tlacopan cut off supply lines. They choked the roads and burned the fields. No food, no messages, only smoke. And from the heart of the lake, Tenochtitlan struck like a blade. Canoes rode silently beneath the moon. Warriors moved like shadows. They scaled walls. They opened gates from within. The siege of Azcapotzalco had begun. The city once called undefeatable, now echoed with screams. Temples burned. Markets collapsed. Soldiers ran. Families wept. And still Maxla stayed in his palace, refused to flee, refused to kneel, until the flames reached his door. Ahuitzotl entered the city like a storm, not with arrogance, but with justice carved into every step. He gave only one order: take him alive. Maxla was dragged from his hall, kicking, screaming, bleeding. The crowd parted as he passed. They remembered his cruelty, the assassinations, the tribute, the silence he forced down their throats. Now, they would speak through fire. At the top of the temple steps, beneath a sky thick with smoke, Maxla stood before the same altar, where he had once offered others. Now it was his turn. He looked into Ahuitzotl's eyes and saw nothing, just the calm certainty of history. The obsidian knife rose and fell. Maxla's heart was torn from his chest, offered to the gods, and to memory. Azcapotzalco had fallen. The empire of fear was no more. The people cheered. They wept. They chanted names that once whispered in darkness. Ahuitzotl, Nezahualcóyotl, Tenochtitlan. At the edge of the lake, the warriors washed their blades in silence, not out of grief, but reverence. They had not just won a war, they had ended an era. In the temple chambers, the alliance was made sacred. Tenochtitlan would lead, Texcoco would advise, Tlacopan would balance. 3 cities, 1 empire. The Aztec world had been born in chains. Now it was reborn in fire. The fires had not yet cooled. Ash still hung in the air. But in the heart of the valley, a crown was being forged, not of gold, but of blood, stone, and memory. Azcapotzalco had fallen. Its palaces were silent, its banners torn. But the victors were not done. They did not return home. They stayed, to build something greater. On the sacred causeway between cities, the 3 lords met again. Not in shadows this time, but in triumph. Ahuitzotl, Nezahualcóyotl, Totoquahuatli, no longer rebels, now founders. They stood beneath the sky, above the broken bones of tyranny, and spoke the words that would shape the age. The world shall not belong to 1 city, but to 3, in alliance, in power, in vengeance. Thus was born the Triple Alliance. Tenochtitlan, the sword; Texcoco, the mind; Tlacopan, the balance. Tenochtitlan would lead. Ahuitzotl would be the first emperor. The sun had a new center. But power is not just declared. It must be demonstrated. And so the tribute system began. Every town that had once bowed to Azcapotzalco now turned toward Tenochtitlan. Gold, jade, cocoa, feathers, corn, all flowed into the lake city. From the coasts, the jungles, the highlands. The empire had no borders yet, but it had a heartbeat, and it was strong. Temples rose higher. The Templo Mayor widened its shadow. The people looked up and saw gods smiling again, not because they were fed, but because their people no longer crawled. Ahuitzotl summoned his priests. He summoned his scribes, and he summoned fire. The old scrolls, those that told of Mexica shame, of slavery, of servitude, he burned them. Let the world forget what we were, he said. Let them only remember what we became. A new history began, written by the victors, by the free. The warriors trained harder. The people worked longer. The city swelled, like lungs preparing for the first cry of war. Because Ahuitzotl knew this victory was not the end. It was the beginning. An empire had been born, but it had to grow, to conquer, to consume. From the ashes of one city, 1,000 battles waited. From the blood of one king, 1,000 crowns would fall. Tenochtitlan had taken its first step. The gods had been honored. The past had been burned. The future was waiting. The city stood still. Tenochtitlan no longer a servant, no longer a whisper in the valley, now a rising sun. But suns do not stay still, and neither did the Mexica. They had taken down a tyrant. They had burned the memory of their chains. But what came next was something older than vengeance. Conquest. Ahuitzotl stood atop the Templo Mayor. The obsidian blade at his side had already tasted the blood of Maxtla. But it wanted more. So did he. The Triple Alliance had been sealed. And now the lake was no longer their limit. It was their origin. The first target was clear. The towns that had once aided Azcapotzalco. The cowards. The betrayers. The ones who bowed to whoever held the whip. Culhuacan, Xochimilco, Coyoacan. Old names, old power, but old walls don't stop new flames. The warriors marched with painted faces, jaguar skins, eagle feathers, heart steady, eyes silent. They did not shout. They did not boast. Their silence was a storm waiting to break. Culhuacan fell first. The city that once laughed at the Mexica, that mocked their wandering, that called them barbarians, now wept beneath burning rooftops. Temples toppled, the nobles dragged from palaces, and for every prisoner taken, an offering was made. The gods had given the Mexica a sign. Now the Mexica gave them blood. From the conquered cities came tribute, corn, beans, obsidian, cloth, but more than goods, they brought fear, a fear that spread like wind. In every town, stories traveled faster than warriors. The lake people are coming. They walk like shadows. They strike like lightning. They burn. Then they vanish. But this was no mindless slaughter. Ahuitzotl moved like a tactician. Every city taken, he spared the fields. He rebuilt roads. He gave protection in exchange for loyalty. Not a conqueror, a builder with blood on his hands. Back in Tenochtitlan, the people watched canoes return, not with fish or fruit, but with captives and gold. The first spoils of empire. Children pointed from docks. Elders offered thanks to Huitzilopochtli, and the priests prepared the altars. Every victory meant sacrifice, not just of enemy hearts, but of the Mexica's own innocence. They were no longer the outcasts, no longer the hungry, no longer the wanderers. They were warriors, and the lake was only the beginning. The valley had knelt, but beyond it lay mountains, jungles, and coasts, lands filled with cities that had never known fear. Yet, Ahuitzotl looked south and saw empire. The army carried the sword, but he carried the soul. Tlacaelel. His name did not echo on the battlefield, but every victory bore his shadow. Every scream, every tribute, every temple, all whispered his design. He was not a king, not a general. He was something older and more dangerous. A thinker, a shaper, the man who bent memory itself. When Ahuitzotl sharpened the obsidian blade, Tlacaelel sharpened the empire's story. He understood something no one else dared to say aloud. To rule the world, you must first rule the past. And so he lit the fire. He ordered the destruction of the old codices, the scrolls, the songs, the records that spoke of the Mexica as wanderers, beggars, outcasts. Gone. He did not erase shame. He buried it, and then he rewrote the world. A new history was born. In it, the Mexica were chosen, not wanderers but warriors, not servants, but sons of the sun god Huitzilopochtli himself. Their suffering had not been weakness, it had been prophecy. We did not rise by accident, he wrote. We rose because the gods demanded it, and from that lie, or that truth, rose a nation of believers. Tlacaelel did more than write. He reshaped faith. In the old days, human sacrifice was rare, a ritual, a symbol. He made it holy, necessary, urgent. The sun, he said, was a warrior, and warriors grow tired. He bleeds light and must be fed, not with prayer, with hearts. He turned war into worship. He turned conquest into cosmic duty. To die in battle was no longer defeat. It was ascension. To be sacrificed was not punishment. It was privilege. Men marched to war not to kill, but to be chosen. He introduced a new kind of war, flower wars, staged battles, not for territory, but for prisoners, for offerings, for balance. The Mexica would fight neighboring cities again and again, not to destroy them, but to reap them. The priests called it sacred. The warriors called it honorable. The empire called it law. And the gods, they drank. Tlacaelel stood beside Ahuitzotl as a shadow beside flame. He whispered into the ears of kings. Even after Ahuitzotl's death, he remained, advising the next ruler, and the next. The empire had emperors, but it had only one architect. He did not wear a crown, but his hands held the weight of the heavens. He had one dream, one vision, to make the Mexica eternal, not through love, not through mercy, but through terror, glory, sacrifice. And the world listened. Cities began to tremble when they heard the drums. Children learned to count using the names of conquered towns. Time was measured in heartbeats lost at temple steps. From the shadows of his chamber, Tlacaelel looked at the maps. They stretched further now, into jungles, into coasts, into lands where even memory failed. But he smiled, because he knew the Aztecs had learned to conquer land. Now, they were conquering belief. The sword was past. Ahuitzotl, first emperor of the Triple Alliance, was gone. His ashes still warm when the council gathered. Not to mourn, but to choose. They did not choose the strongest warrior. They chose the quietest. Montezuma Ilwakamina, a noble, priest, a man of prayer who knew the rhythm of war. Not born to scream, but born to shape. He did not enter the throne room with fanfare. He walked barefoot, unarmed, but when he sat, the stone beneath him felt heavier. The crown of Tenochtitlan was no longer a weight. It was a calling, and Montezuma was ready to answer it. He was a ruler unlike any before, not a conqueror, not a slave, but a bridge between gods and men. He believed order was divine, that harmony came not from peace, but from balance, and balance required structure, obedience, sacrifice. He built roads that stretched across mountains, markets that overflowed with gold and maize, laws that etched discipline into the bones of commoners and nobles alike. Everything had its place, everything had its time, and under his rule, the empire began to move like a single beating heart. But he was not weak. His hands were soft from scrolls, but his eyes, they saw far. When tribute faltered, he sent warriors. When cities rebelled, he burned their temples. then rebuilt them with Mexica stone. He expanded north into the drylands, south into the valleys, east to the coast, and everywhere he went, he did not ask. He declared, "You will bow to the sun, or you will be swallowed by its fire." He ruled for nearly 30 years, 3 decades of planning, building, reforming. He created Kalmukak's elite schools for nobles, taught philosophy, astronomy, discipline. He built Telpakalis war colleges for commoners, forged warriors from mud and blood. He wasn't just raising soldiers, he was raising a civilization. And yet Montezuma never smiled. He walked alone in palace halls, spoke softly in council, listened more than he spoke. Some called him cold, others divine, but all agreed he was not a man of this world. He understood the future required fear, not love, not mercy. So the temples grew taller, the drums grew louder, the sacrifices more frequent. Atop the Templo Mayor, Montezuma watched hearts rise like offerings to the stars. He never looked away, not once, because he believed the gods watched too, and a king who flinched invited ruin. The empire swelled. Tribute flooded the capital. Jaguar pelts, cocoa beans, gold, obsidian, slaves. Tenochtitlan became a jewel, floating in the lake, shining like a second sun. But beneath that brilliance, the blade never dulled. Montezuma knew the truth. An empire built on blood must always thirst for more. When he died, they say the sun paused in the sky, the markets stopped, the wind stilled, even the priests fell silent, because they knew a builder had left them, a thinker, a ruler, a god in flesh, and what came next would not be peace. After Moctezuma's rise came the flood. The crown passed to new hands, but the blood still ran in the same direction. Empire. The foundation was built. The temples stood. The gods were fed. Now the world had to be reminded. The sun had only just begun to burn. Tenochtitlan no longer fought for survival. It fought for dominance. The jaguar knights sharpened their claws. The eagle warriors opened their wings. And the empire pointed south, toward lands lush with jungle, rich with jade, proud with cities that still dared stand alone. Oaxaca, Huastec, Mixtec, Tepanecs, names that would soon be written in fire. The Mexica marched like a storm with memory. They remembered their exile. They remembered their shame. And now they carried the message of Huitzilopoctli in obsidian and flame. They struck like thunder. The Gulf Coast fell first. Its cities drowned not in water, but in tribute. Tons of cocoa, shells, gold. The bodies of rebels lined the roads, a warning in flesh. Then came the mountains of Oaxaca. The Mixtecs fought fiercely. They knew the terrain. They believed themselves invincible. But belief dies quickly when it meets hunger wrapped in discipline. The Aztecs didn't just conquer. They dismantled. They tore down gods, rebuilt temples, replaced local rulers with loyal governors. One by one, proud kingdoms became tributaries, allowed to live, but only as long as they bled. And through it all, the Triple Alliance moved like one body. Tenochtitlan, muscle. Texcoco, mind. Tlacopan, balance. 3 blades, 1 strike. And with each city taken, the alliance grew stronger and more unequal. Tenochtitlan began to swallow the others. His tribute grew larger, his voice louder. Soon it was no longer an alliance. It was a throne, and everything else bowed. Even the sky seemed to darken with their name, Azteca. Children across Mesoamerica were taught that name with fear, or with reverence. or both. Some resisted. Rebellions flared in the Aztec lands. Highland towns refused to pay. But resistance was a language the Aztecs understood and silenced. Entire populations were marched to the capital, not for punishment, but for sacrifice. Their hearts would speak what their mouths would not. Temples needed to be fed. The gods were hungry, and war was the only offering they truly loved. So the flower wars continued, not to win, but to bleed. Captured warriors marched up temple steps willingly. They smiled, because death on the stone meant life beyond the stars. The more the empire grew, the more it needed war to sustain itself. War brought prisoners. Prisoners brought sacrifice. Sacrifice brought cosmic balance. And so, peace was forbidden. By the late 1460s, the Aztecs ruled an empire of empires. From sea to mountain, from jungle to desert, hundreds of cities paid tribute. Thousands of captives walked in chains. And in the center of it all, like the beating heart of a giant, Tenochtitlan, stood with stone streets, gleaming canals, temples so high they kissed the heavens. The greatest city the New World had ever seen. But as it rose higher, cast longer shadows. And in those shadows, destiny was stirring. The empire stood victorious. But victory was not peace. With every city taken, with every tribute basket delivered, Tenochtitlan became something more and something heavier. The gods were pleased, but they were never satisfied, because empires built on sacrifice must keep bleeding, or they rot. Every sunrise brought new goods into the capital. From the coasts came salt and coral, cocoa beans packed like treasure. From the highlands, obsidian, cotton, wild game. From the jungles, jade, feathers, exotic beasts in cages. Every day, the great marketplaces overflowed. Bartering never stopped. Even the poorest citizen touched goods that once belonged to kings. But none of it was free. Each feather, each grain of maize, each shimmering gem, paid for in sweat or in blood. Because tribute wasn't just economy, it was control. The empire kept tallied records. Every city owed its due, and when it failed to deliver, war followed, not as punishment, but as policy. In the palace archives, priests and scribes recorded every item, scroll after scroll, pictographs of towns bowing, paying, pleading. The Mexica didn't just conquer people. They conquered time, memory, debt. And as wealth piled higher, so did the stone. Temples rose, taller, wider, more terrifying. The Templo Mayor, heart of Tenochtitlan, was rebuilt again and again. Each time, a new layer, a new god's glory, a new offering to eternity. It was no longer a place of worship. It was a mountain of sacrifice, built with screams, crowned with fire. At its summit, two shrines faced the sun. One for Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun. One for Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Two hungers that could never be filled. Festivals grew larger, ceremonies more elaborate. Some lasted days, with music, dancing, poetry. Others lasted minutes, a blade through a chest, a heart lifted steaming to the sky. Children were taught that the sun would die, if not fed with blood. Not metaphor, not myth, truth, their truth. To live in the empire meant to live inside a machine of balance, a sacred will greased with sacrifice. Some asked questions, some doubted, but not aloud, because in a world where the sun might fall, doubt was betrayal. Behind closed doors, philosophers wondered, is this power Or is this burden? But the empire was too loud to hear them. Drums thundered, chants echoed, markets swelled, and the gods, they demanded the same thing every morning. More. And so more was given. More tribute, more roads, more cities, more hearts. The empire could not rest. To stop was to die. By now, Tenochtitlan was no longer just a city. It was a myth built from stone, a reflection of the heavens, a mirror of the gods. But mirrors crack, even stone breaks, and far beyond the horizon, winds were shifting, waves were rising, not of rebellion, not yet, something stranger, something foreign. The empire had climbed too high, and the higher you climb, the more the sky begins to burn. The world they believed was on borrowed time, not a paradise, not a gift, but a battlefield between gods. And humans were the ones who paid the debt. The Mexica did not worship gently. They did not kneel with soft songs. They believed the sun itself was dying, draining its blood across the sky every evening, and if it bled, it must be fed. This belief was not metaphor. It was law, etched into stone, taught in every school, chanted in every marketplace. We are the people of the sun, they said, and the sun must eat. In their sacred texts, the world had been born 5 times. Each age had collapsed, devoured by wind, flood, beasts, or flame. Now they lived in the 5th sun, the final era, the most fragile one, its light sustained not by nature, but by blood, human blood. They called it Nextlawali, the debt payment, to live, to breathe, to harvest, to walk under the sun. All of it owed something, and if that debt went unpaid, the skies would fall. So sacrifice was not cruelty, it was balance, it was mercy, it was survival. The blade was not punishment, it was an offering, a gift back to the gods, who had torn open their own chests to create life. Now mortals had to return the favor. At the heart of it all stood Huitzilopochtli, god of war, god of the sun, god of the Mexica themselves. He had led their ancestors from the north, spoken through visions, brought them to the lake island. Now he demanded repayment. Huitzilopochtli was not gentle. He was a god of fire, steel, and sacrifice. Each dawn he fought darkness. Each dusk he barely survived. And he needed help. Without hearts, the sun stops. Without blood, the heavens collapse. This is what every child was taught, not just in temples, but in homes, in markets, in war schools. Boys dreamed of dying in battle, not because they were fearless, but because they believed it would keep the world alive. And girls wept at the thought of dying in childbirth, but were told, if you die giving life, you rise with the sun. Sacrifice was not the end of life. It was the culmination of it. To be offered on the altar meant you were chosen, exalted, transformed. Prisoners were not dragged screaming. Many walked with pride, chests painted, eyes wide. Some smiled, some sang, because they believed, in that final moment, they were becoming part of the sun itself. The heart once lifted was not just blood and muscle. It was a message, a reminder to the gods. We have not forgotten. We are still loyal. Keep the sky burning. The world they lived in was brutal, yes, but to them, not believing in sacrifice would have been more brutal still. It would mean darkness, extinction, the end of everything. So they climbed the temples, held the blade, sang the songs, and watched the sunrise, like a god's eye opening once more. not because it wanted to, but because they had fed it. In the heart of Tenochtitlan, a mountain rose from the lake, not of earth, but of stone, built not by nature, but by hands. It was called the Templo Mayor, the Great Temple. But to the Mexica, it was something far greater, not just a monument, not just a shrine. It was the axis between the heavens and the underworld, the bridge between men and gods. Its twin staircases rose like fangs into the sky. At the top, 2 shrines, 2 thrones for gods who ruled in contradiction. One was painted blue, the other red. Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, reign and war, life and death. Together they formed the cycle. Together they ruled the empire. One fed the crops, the other fed the conquest, and both had to be worshipped, always together, never alone. Every layer of the temple told a story. It was rebuilt again and again, expanded with each great reign, thickened with fresh stone and fresh blood. Each expansion meant victory, each stair carved by tribute, each brick stamped with memory. When the temple grew, it was not just architecture, it was statement, a warning to enemies, promise to the gods. We are still worthy, we are still strong. To climb the temple was to ascend toward divinity, step by step, breath by breath, closer to the gods, closer to judgment. Priests in black robes would lead the chosen. Drums thundered, incense burned like mist around a battlefield. The city fell silent, as one heart prepared to stop beating, so the suns could continue. From the summit, all of Tenochtitlan could be seen, lakes shimmering in the distance, canals like veins pulsing through stone, mountains circling like ancient watchers. But no gaze was higher than the shrine, and no throne more terrifying. The shrines were small, but what stood inside them was immense. Stone idols, wide-eyed and eternal, decorated with feathers, bones, and jewels. Huitzilopochtli's idol held a serpent blade. Tlaloc's idol grinned with jagged teeth. They did not smile, they judged. Blood would run down the steps like red waterfalls, steam rising from fresh hearts, chants echoing into the heavens. And below, the people watched, not with horror, but with awe, because they believed they were watching the world survive. Templo Mayor wasn't just the tallest structure. It was the center of everything: faith, war, law, agriculture, power. The empire did not revolve around a palace. It revolved around an altar. Every great leader rebuilt it, taller, wider, stronger. Ahuitzotl, the Conqueror king, would one day add the largest expansion. They say 20,000 captives were sacrificed to bless its dedication. Some say that number is legend, but the terror it inspired was very real. Foreign rulers sent gifts, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. To ignore the temple was to risk the gods. To mock it was to invite ruin. It was both heaven and hell. It united opposites, the rain and the blade, the womb and the grave, hope and horror, and all of it chiseled in silence, by hands who believed that to build a mountain was to speak to the stars. The year turned like a circle of fire. 18 times it ignited, 18 festivals, 18 faces of the gods, and every one of them demanded something in return. To the Mexica, time wasn't a line, it was a wheel. Each festival brought them closer to the gods, and reminded them how easily the world could stop turning. If the gods were not honored, it would all collapse. So they prepared. Streets swept clean, temples scrubbed in sacred water, priests painted head to toe, blue for the sky, black for the night. Children sang. Merchants closed their stalls. Families fasted. Warriors polished their blades. Even the city paused to breathe with the gods. Some festivals were for rain. They marched boys dressed as frogs, chanting, dancing, splashing through puddles. They would later be sacrificed to ask Tlaloc for mercy. Others were for fire. The new fire ceremony came every 52 years, a moment when the calendars aligned and the world teetered on destruction. All flames were extinguished. Darkness ruled for one terrifying night. If the gods allowed the sun to rise, a fire was lit on a prisoner's chest. That flame rekindled every hearth in the empire. And then came the Tlacaxiphualiztli, the flaying of men, a festival of war and blood, a theater of death. Captured warriors were paraded, given wooden swords, dressed in feathers. They fought elite Mexica warriors in ritual duels, knowing they would lose, but they fought with pride, because to die in this way was to become part of the myth. The losing warriors were dragged up the temple stairs, hearts cut, skins peeled. Priests wore the skins like sacred robes for 20 days, not as cruelty, but as resurrection. They believed this act brought new life to the earth. The flayed god had to die so the crops could grow. Spectacle filled every corner of the capital. Drums beat like thunder. Flutes cried like ghosts. Dancers spun in golden masks, some portraying gods, others portraying victims. Poets recited verses of the stars. Children laughed, unaware that a sacrifice would follow the final song. But for the Mexica, this wasn't horror. This was harmony. Every offering, every dance, every drop of blood was part of a choreography, a dance between men and gods. Life fed death, and death fed life. No one was exempt, not even the highborn. When the maize fields withered, even noble sons were offered, their hearts seen as more precious, because the gods did not want the worthless. They demanded the best. And yet, despite the blood, the festivals were full of joy. Yes, joy, because to serve the gods meant the sun would rise, the rain would fall, the corn would grow. They celebrated not the act of dying, but the meaning behind it. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world. Now humans had to answer. To live in this empire was to walk a tightrope between reverence and terror, between life and the knife. In the shadow of temples, faith did not whisper, commanded. It ruled, it bled. To the Mexica, belief was not private, not quiet, not optional. Pulsed through their laws. It shaped their cities. It chose who lived and who climbed the steps to die. Every child was born into a world already carved with expectation. From their first breath, they were taught the truth. The gods were watching, always, and those gods were hungry. Boys were trained for war, not just with spears, but with purpose. Bring back captives, their instructors said, or do not come back at all, not to punish, but to serve something higher. A warrior who returned empty-handed brought shame to his family, to his ancestors, to the sun itself. Girls, too, had their burdens, to birth warriors, to grind maize, to serve the cycles of life and blood. And if they died in childbirth, they were honored as if slain in battle, riding the sky with the sun. Even harvests were tied to faith. A bad crop was not nature's fault. It was spiritual failure. Perhaps a ritual was missed, a sacrifice delayed, an offering too small. The solution: more blood, more prayer, more certainty that they were still heard. Priests were not soft figures in the shadows. They were feared, respected, trusted with time itself. They studied stars, counted calendars, read omens in fire, wind, and dream. And when the gods demanded it, they held the knife. Their bodies were walking skeletons, emaciated from fasting, their earlobes torn with thorns, their tongues scarred from self-sacrifice. They gave their own blood first, before they ever took another's, because the gods listened only to those who proved they were serious. But there was more than devotion in the air. There was fear, because doubt was dangerous. To question the gods was to endanger the sun. To refuse a ritual was to betray all of creation. So people obeyed, not blindly, but urgently, as if the fate of the cosmos depended on it, because to them, it did. The flower wars weren't only about honor. They were policy, wars not to conquer land, but to capture bodies. Prisoners were not random. They were counted, measured, preserved, not killed in battle, but saved for the temple, because dead in war meant nothing. Dead on the altar, that fed the sun. Thus the empire grew, not just with roads and cities, but with fear woven into every stone. Fear that the sun might die, fear that the rain would stop, fear that one forgotten chant could break the balance forever. It was not paranoia, it was structure, and it worked. The empire stood tall, the temples rose higher, the people stayed in line, because what they believed in was not just a god, but a system older than memory, stronger than law, wired into the soul. But even stone cracks, even fear fades, and just beyond the edge of their maps, something else was stirring. A new kind of faith, a new kind of fire, one that would not be stopped by prayer or tribute or sacrifice. Not a god, but a stranger with steel. At sunrise, the city shimmered. Tenochtitlan, island capital of the Mexica, cradled by the calm waters of Lake Texcoco, a vision rising from mist and mirrored sky. Stone temples touched the clouds. Canals glided between homes like silent roads. Floating gardens, chinampas, bloomed in the lake, green veins feeding a city of blood and gold. It was a miracle made by hands, not gods. Wide causeways stretched across the lake like arms. 3 grand roads, each guarded by towers and bridges, ready to rise if enemies approached. Canoes moved through canals like birds in flight. Fishermen, priests, merchants, messengers, all part of a silent dance, in a city of perfect rhythm. In the heart of it all, the sacred precinct pulsed with life. The Templo Mayor loomed above everything. Its twin staircases pointed to the heavens, casting long shadows at dusk. Next to it, palaces of kings, homes of nobles, schools of priests. Everything built with balance. Everything speaking the language of the gods. And nearby, the heart of trade, Tlatelolco, a market so vast, it could hold 20,000 people in a single breath. Colors, spices, feathers, obsidian, cocoa beans, a chorus of barter and blessing, a world within the world. From above, the city looked eternal, but in its silence, the water stirred, because even the most beautiful cities can be broken, and Tenochtitlan's time was already running out. Beneath the grandeur of stone and water, there was discipline. The Mexico world did not run on chaos. It ran on order, a delicate architecture of class, duty, and ritual. Every citizen had a place, and every place came with expectation. At the top stood the nobles, the Pippleton, warriors, priests, governors. guardians of tradition, keepers of law. Below them, the Ahuitzotl commoners, farmers, builders, merchants, teachers, the lifeblood of the empire, quiet, obedient, essential. At the bottom, the Tenochtitlan slaves, not broken but bound, often debtors, criminals, yet still with rights, still part of the order. Even childhood followed sacred lines. Boys were trained in two paths: the Kalmakak for nobles, where they studied law, astronomy, and leadership, and the Telpakali for commoners, where they learned war, labor, and loyalty. Girls were raised to run households, to grind maize and tend to gods, to birth warriors and pass on songs. Nothing was wasted, not time, not breath. Marriage was ritual, commerce was sacred, punishment was swift. Stealing once meant shame, twice meant death. The city was not just ruled by warriors, it was ruled by belief. Every act, every law, every step across the stone was done to keep the balance, to honor the gods, to protect the people, to hold the sky in place. But perfection holds pressure, and under this structure, cracks were growing. Tenochtitlan was not just built with stone, it was built with story. Every wall painted with gods and battles, every pot carved with symbols of sky and earth, every song a prayer, every dance a retelling of the cosmos. The people were artists of survival, and in their hands even suffering became sacred. They made poetry of rain, sculptures of serpents, feathers into crowns that shimmered like fire. They sang to greet the morning. They wrote to honor the dead. They carved obsidian mirrors to speak with the unseen. And in the markets, in the kitchens, in the quiet homes, life bloomed in taste and color. Tortillas hot and soft from clay stoves, maize ground daily by women singing lullabies, chili, beans, avocados, tomatoes, a feast born from the lake and earth. And the sacred drink, Ahuitzotl, bitter chocolate, whipped with spices, drunk by nobles and warriors before battle. Clothing, too, told stories. Nobles wore cotton and jade. Commoners wore maguey fiber and woven symbols. Every stitch carried a name. Every color spoke a meaning. This was not just a city. It was a living canvas, a breathing poem, a world where even silence had shape. But beauty, like balance, can be delicate, and as the skies began to shift, the songs grew quieter. Even joy began to listen for thunder. The city stood like a dream, stone rising from water, gold glinting beneath the sun. A world in rhythm, measured, sacred, complete. But perfection is quiet, just before it breaks. The signs came slowly, winds that howled like ghosts, flames that danced in temple skies without fuel, comets tearing across the heavens, leaving dread in their wake. The priests consulted the calendars. The scribes flipped through painted codices. And still, the omens came, a mirror in the sky, a woman weeping in the night, a voice whispering, "Your children will die." And yet, life continued. The markets bustled, the temples bled, the schools taught obedience, the farmers harvested chinampas beneath the rising sun. The capital still breathed, still believed, because what else could they do? They had built paradise from mud and blood. How could it fall? But far beyond the lake, beyond the mountains, beyond the memory of maps, ships cut through the sea, wooden beasts with sails like wings, carrying gods no one had prayed to, carrying metal that could wound stone, carrying men who did not fear temples. Tenochtitlan stood ready for anything except them, and so, as the drums beat for yet another festival, and the sun climbed the eastern sky, The city prepared to honor the gods, unknowing, unseeing, unprepared. The city gathered in silence. Drums waited, blades glinted, the sky held its breath. At the center, a man stood still, wrapped in obsidian-black cotton, jaguar pelt across his shoulders, his face painted like death and fire. Ahuitzotl, son of the gods, brother to emperors, and now ruler of an empire carved from bone. He was not gentle, not thoughtful, not like his predecessor Tizak. A king remembered more for hesitation than for triumph. Tizak had ruled in doubt. Ahuitzotl would rule in war. From the very beginning, his presence shook the palace. He spoke with his fists. He moved like a storm. He didn't negotiate, he demanded, and the empire listened. His name meant water beast, a mythical creature that dragged men beneath the surface and held them there until they stopped struggling. It suited him perfectly. He wasn't born to rule. He was born to conquer. Within weeks of his coronation, he declared war, not on one enemy, but on many, on rebellious provinces, on rival city-states, on the edge of the known world. He led armies into the southern jungles, north into the mountains, east into lands where no Mexica had marched before. He crushed the Mixtecs, took the Pacific coast, raised temples in lands that had never known Huitzilopochtli's name. He returned to Tenochtitlan not as a king, but as a living god. Behind him came prisoners in chains, caravans of jade and cacao, stacks of tropical feathers, cages of exotic beasts for the zoo. He had fed the empire, and the empire feasted. But it wasn't enough. Ahuitzotl did not believe in enough. He didn't want to maintain the empire. He wanted to reshape it, bigger, bloodier, brighter than the sun. He ordered a vast expansion of the Templo Mayor, the sacred pyramid at the heart of the city. Stone by stone, it rose higher, a mountain for the gods, a mountain that would soon drink. He reformed the military, promoted new warrior ranks, increased tribute quotas. For every campaign, the message was clear: conquer or be conquered. Even his advisors began to fear him. They whispered behind fans and robes, but no one dared speak aloud, because Ahuitzotl didn't just fight enemies. He made them vanish. And yet the people adored him. Why? Because the rains came, the granaries filled, the markets swelled with food and goods and color, because he had made them rich and made them feared. Still, something dark followed him, an echo in the drums, a shadow in the firelight. He had begun to build something more than empire, something ancient, something reckless. In the temples, priests prepared blades of obsidian. In the countryside, captives were counted like cattle. In the city, whispers grew louder. He will dedicate the temple with more blood than ever before. Ahuitzotl stood at the edge of power, looking down on a world shaped by his will. But he did not see the edge crumbling beneath his feet, because men like him don't look down. The drums no longer paused. They beat like thunder in the bones, echoing across mountains, across lakes, across the hearts of conquered cities. The empire no longer grew. It devoured. Ahuitzotl had set fire to the map. Under his command, armies marched in every direction. Cities fell like fruit shaken loose from trees, from Oaxaca to the Pacific, from the Gulf Coast to the jungle's edge. Enemies surrendered before the first blow. Those who didn't were made examples. With every victory came tribute: obsidian, gold, slaves, cotton, cacao, and above all, prisoners. The empire didn't just want their land. It wanted their blood. Because conquest to Ahuitzotl was not strategy. It was ritual. It wasn't just power. It was devotion. Every captive marched back to Tenochtitlan was a gift to the gods. Every city burned was an offering of ash. Temples no longer waited for festivals. They pulsed with life daily, each step stained deeper with red, each priest sharper with practice. And the people believed. They had to, because this was not cruelty. It was balance. The sun burned because of sacrifice. The rains fell because the gods were fed. Without blood, the world would end. Ahuitzotl knew the calendar. He saw the signs. The great temple, Templo Mayor, was nearly finished. Its expansion, his crown. It had to be dedicated, and not with words, not with song, with death. The numbers began to rise. Captives from every corner of the empire, bound, marked, counted. Some say 10,000, others 20,000. No one knows for sure, only that the city prepared, as if the gods themselves were coming to feast. The day drew near. Messengers flew across the valleys. Nobles arrived from distant provinces. Even rival kings came, not in defiance, but in fear. To deny the invitation was to question the gods. The streets were swept, the markets overfilled, the pyramids polished, and deep inside the temples, priests sharpened their knives, obsidian thin as a whisper, sharp enough to part a soul. Ahuitzotl stood above them all, watching, waiting. He had become more than king. To the people, he was the voice of the gods. To his enemies, he was the knife in the dark. But beneath the glory, something cracked. The conquered provinces grew bitter, their markets drained by tribute, their sons taken for war, their daughters claimed by force. Behind the gifts and ceremony, there was resentment, a storm brewing in silence. Still, the king did not slow. He only marched forward, toward his temple, toward his legacy, toward a moment the world would never forget. The pyramid was ready, the people were watching, and the gods were hungry. It began at sunrise. The mist still clung to the lake. Canoes drifted toward the city like shadows returning home. And in the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, the crowd waited in silence. They had come from every corner of the empire, lords, warriors, priests, and peasants. Tenochtitlan stood as the heart of the world, and today that heart would beat with thunder. At the center of the ritual stood the Templo Mayor, now taller, wider, hungrier, a double pyramid with twin stairways, one for Tlaloc, god of rain, one for Huitzilopochtli, god of war. Newly rebuilt by Ahuitzotl's command, it was no longer just a temple. It was a mountain of blood and flame, a stairway between earth and heaven. On its highest platform, priests waited bare-chested, their knives gleaming, feathers in their hair, ash on their skin, eyes hollow with trance. They had fasted, prayed, purified themselves. Now they would speak with gods, through flesh. The captives were brought forward, thousands, from distant cities, foreign tribes, rival kingdoms, bound by cords, painted in blue, their chests bare, their eyes lifted toward the rising sun. They were not nameless. Each had a home, family, a breath, but that would end here, beneath the blade. The drums began, deep, slow, ancient, like the heartbeat of the earth returning. One by one, they were led up the steps, up the pyramid, toward the gods. The crowd chanted, the priests raised their hands, and the knives came down, fast, precise. Obsidian flashed, and the chest opened, the heart lifted, still warm, still beating, offered to the heavens, to feed the sun, to keep the world from falling. It did not stop. All day, all night, for days. Some say 20,000 died. Some say more. The steps of the pyramid ran red. The scent of blood mixed with incense. And still the drums beat. This was not horror. This was cosmic duty. The gods had given breath. Now the people gave it back. Ahuitzotl stood above it all, crowned in feathers and gold, unblinking, unmoving, watching the bodies fall, watching the temple drink. This was his masterpiece, his monument to fear, to faith, to forever. Below, the people rejoiced. They sang songs of triumph, danced barefoot in blood-soaked courtyards, through flowers, lit fires, lifted their children to see. The empire was at its peak. The gods had been fed. The sun would rise again. But behind the celebration, there were cracks. Provinces drained by tribute and war, muttered in corners. Allies grew restless. Whispers floated through the market stalls like smoke. Too much blood. Too many taken. What more will he demand? Even nature seemed to recoil. The lake trembled. Rains came late. A famine crept near. And in the temples, the gods grew quiet. But on this day, no one cared, because Ahuitzotl had done what none had before. He had built a temple to the sky and filled it with hearts. It began with water, not blood, not war, not prophecy, but water, quiet, creeping, cold. It rose not from the gods, but from the mistake of a king. Ahuitzotl, the empire's greatest conqueror, wanted more than territory and temples. He wanted to control the elements themselves. The mountains held lakes. Those lakes fed rivers. And Ahuitzotl dreamed of turning them toward the city, to bless Tenochtitlan with life, wealth, fertility. And so he ordered the building of a great aqueduct, a feat of engineering, a gift from the mountains to the gods. But the gods do not always accept gifts. The water came too fast. The tunnels were unfinished. The channels too narrow. The season too wet. One night, the mountain lakes overflowed. Rain fell in sheets. The sky turned black with thunder. And Lake Texcoco rose to reclaim what man had built. Water surged into the city like a living thing. Streets became rivers. Homes vanished. Temples groaned beneath the weight. People screamed. Families drowned in the same canals they once traveled with joy. The empire's heart, Tenochtitlan, began to rot from within. For days it didn't stop. Canoes carried bodies instead of goods. Disease followed. Starvation whispered at the edges of the markets. It was not an enemy's sword. It was not a foreign invasion. It was hubris dressed as ambition. Ahuitzotl was forced to act. He ordered the construction of dikes and levees, summoned laborers from across the empire, moved temples, tore down bridges, diverted the waters by force. But even then, the damage had been done. Whispers returned. He angered the gods. He built too high. He asked too much. The same people who cheered as the captives died now cursed the king behind closed doors. And then, as if nature had delivered its verdict, Ahuitzotl died. No battle, no grand ceremony, no prophecy fulfilled. Some say it was illness. Others say it was grief. A few whisper that he fell in the flooded tunnels, drowned by the very water he summoned. Like his namesake, the water beast dragged down by the current. His death sent a hush through the capital. This was not just the end of a reign. It was the end of an era. Ahuitzotl had ruled like a god, expanded the empire to its furthest edge, raised temples, rewritten laws, rebuilt the sky itself. But all empires that rise like mountains must one day hear the wind howl at their peak. The people gathered to burn his body. Priests chanted. Drums thundered low. Smoke rose from the pyre, curling into the gray morning sky, a soul returning to the heavens, or sinking into the lake below. No one could say. And in the silence that followed, a new figure stepped into the light. His name was Montezuma. He was noble, wise, educated in temples and trained in war. But unlike Ahuitzotl, he feared the gods, and soon he would fear something far worse. The empire stood at its peak, and from the sacred heart of Tenochtitlan, a new king rose to claim the sun. His name was Montezuma Xocoyotzin, ninth Teletoni, chosen not by war, but by the gods. He had been a priest before he was a king, a man of ritual, learning, and prayer. He knew the ancient texts. He could read the stars. He spoke with the calm of a scribe and the silence of a storm. The people called him wise. The nobles called him pure. The gods, it seemed, called him now. His coronation was grand. Drums echoed across the lake. Flowers fell from rooftops, and the blood of captives baptized the steps of the great temple. It was tradition, and tradition demanded sacrifice. But behind the celebration, Montezuma stood alone. He carried more than a crown. He carried a prophecy of a world nearing its end. From his first day, he ruled with precision. He purged corruption, elevated loyal priests, reinforced military ranks. His court became rigid, his gaze unblinking. He demanded respect, and received it. Even nobles bowed lower. Even warriors whispered his name like a spell. But power has its price, and somewhere in Montezuma's eyes, there was always fear, not of men, not of war, but of the sky, of the gods, of what was coming. The empire was glorious, but Montezuma ruled as if walking through a dream, waiting for the dream to break. It began with fire in the sky. A comet, bright and unnatural, blazed across the heavens for nights without end. The priests watched in silence. The nobles avoided its glow. Only Montezuma stood beneath it, still, shaken, knowing what it meant. Then came the lake that boiled, the wind that tore temples from their roots, lightning that struck without clouds. In the night, the cries of women echoed, "My children, we are lost." From far provinces came stranger tales, obsidian mirrors that showed armies in the sky, statues that wept blood, fishermen who pulled flaming birds from the water. One temple burned, without cause, without flame. The gods, it seemed, were restless. Montezuma gathered his priests. He demanded answers, but none came, only riddles, only silence. He turned inward. He fasted more, sacrificed more, slept less. He searched the stars like a man drowning, hoping for a sign that the end could still be delayed. But every day, the signs grew darker. He no longer trusted his dreams. He no longer trusted his gods. And worst of all, he no longer trusted himself. In the markets, people whispered. In the temples, voices trembled. The empire still stood, but the sky above it no longer felt safe. And Montezuma, high on his throne, waited for something he could not name, but always feared would come. On the surface, the empire was still whole. The markets were full. The temples were tall. The warriors still marched through the causeways with painted faces and sharpened spears. But beneath it all, the foundations had begun to crack. The provinces groaned under tribute. Distant cities whispered of revolt. Allies grew cold. Enemies grew bold. And Montezuma, instead of reaching out, withdrew further into his palace. He tightened his court, surrounded himself with priests and dream readers, sent spies into noble houses, demanded omens before every decision. Fear had become policy. Silence had become law. To challenge Montezuma was to challenge the gods. Few dared, but many began to resent. Once the people saw him as divine. Now they saw a shadowed man, haunted by signs only he could read. He walked the palace halls like a ghost. He prayed as if trying to bargain with fate. The empire's heart, once loud and proud, now beat with quiet anxiety. Even the lake seemed to reflect it, its waters darker, stiller, colder. And then, from the eastern coast, came word of ships, great beasts with wings, men with skin like bone and eyes like stone. They came from the sea, with thunder, with beasts, with fire. Montezuma heard, and froze. It has begun. He did not raise an army. He did not prepare for war. He prepared for prophecy. The winds shifted. Far beyond the lakes and mountains, a sail rose on the horizon, white, wide, unnatural. The first to see it were fishermen. They returned in silence, eyes wide with terror. Floating mountains, they said, men with metal skin, beasts with thunder in their breath. Montezuma listened and said nothing. Inside he broke. He locked himself in the palace, sent no armies, spoke to no generals. Instead, he turned to the gods, searching the stars, the smoke, the stones. It had come, the thing he feared, the thing the omens warned of. Messengers followed, from the coast, from the provinces. They brought tales of strange men with pale faces, hair like fire, and weapons that roared like storms. They called their leader Cortez. He rode a beast, spoke in riddles, and demanded gold. And still Montezuma hesitated, not out of weakness, but out of belief. What if this was Quetzalcoatl, the god of knowledge, returned from across the sea? To reclaim what was his, to attack him would be sacrilege. To welcome him could be suicide. The emperor chose silence. He sent gifts, jewels, feathers, gold masks, an offering, a test. But the stranger did not stop. He kept walking toward the valley, toward the lake, toward the heart of the empire. And Montezuma waited as a god approached, or a destroyer, or both. The sky no longer brought comfort. It bled. It burned. It whispered in the language of gods no one could understand. Over Tenochtitlan, a comet screamed across the heavens, its tail long as the lake itself. The priests watched it for nights, silent. When it vanished, they still said nothing. They couldn't. Even the gods had grown quiet. Then the temple caught fire. The same stones that had once drunk blood now cracked and crumbled in heat. There was no lightning, no wind, only flame, as if the heavens had exhaled. The people gathered in silence, watching their world unmake itself. Then came the floods. Lake Texcoco overflowed. Streets disappeared. Children were swept into canals. Disease followed. Fevers, blisters, rotting breath. The marketplace grew quiet. The great causeways emptied. Even the drums in the temples slowed. And through it all, Montezuma watched. He fasted. He wept. He sacrificed. But the gods gave no reply, not even in blood. A voice was heard at night, a woman crying, not seen, only heard. "Oh, my children, your end is near." The city froze when her voice echoed across the lake. The fishermen stopped sailing. The merchants stopped trading. Even the warriors grew afraid. It was not war that haunted Tenochtitlan. Not yet. It was the unknown. The feeling that something larger had begun. Something no sword could kill. No king could stop. And far to the east, beneath the rising sun, the stranger kept coming. They came not as a wave, but as a thread of thunder weaving through the land. Cortez marched inland, with men clad in steel, faces pale, eyes sharp as obsidian. Behind them rode beasts no one had seen before, horses, tall and restless, breathing clouds, hooves like war drums. The messengers brought tales to Tenochtitlan. They carry sticks that spit fire. Their armor cannot be pierced. Their blood is white. At first the Mexica laughed. Then they listened. Then they feared. But the invaders did not come alone. At every step they made friends from old Aztec enemies, Tlaxcalans, Tepanecs, Calulans, nations long crushed beneath tribute and sacrifice. Now those nations rose, not for freedom, but for revenge. Cortez promised them salvation. He offered gifts, lies, steel, and the people followed him like a god. He crossed rivers, he climbed mountains, and with each step, he grew closer to the heart of the empire. Montezuma watched from afar, still uncertain, still silent. Was this a god returning, or a storm approaching? His priests offered no answer. His generals demanded action. But Montezuma gave only gifts, feathers, gold, words. The strangers took them and kept coming, not fast, but certain, like fate carved into stone. The valley, once ruled by fear of Tenochtitlan, now whispered a new name, Cortez, and the gods watched, still silent, still distant. The crown had never felt heavier. Montezuma sat beneath the serpent throne, surrounded by silence, not respect, but hesitation. His court no longer moved as one. Nobles whispered behind curtains. Generals paced like caged jaguars. Even the priests, once confident, grew unsure of their gods. He had been chosen to speak for the divine, but now he spoke less each day. He watched the smoke from the temple fires, as if hoping the wind would carry an answer. None came. Outside the palace, the people asked questions no one dared voice aloud. Why hasn't he fought? Is he protecting us, or protecting them? The empire, once united by fear and faith, began to split down the middle. One side still believed, the other prepared for war. The enemy marched ever closer. Their fires burned on distant hills. Foreign drums echoed through the forests. Strange banners flew where Aztec tribute once ruled. And still Montezuma waited. He sent gifts, more gold, more feathers, more apologies. Cortez smiled and demanded more. Within the palace, voices rose. Tlaxcalan's legacy of power and blood was fading. Now the empire stood still, led by a man torn between prophecy and fear. In the shadows, some began to wonder if the gods would not act. Should the people? They came at dawn. Over the eastern causeway, the strangers appeared, shimmering in armor, faces pale, ice cold as obsidian. At their front rode Cortez, mounted high, helmet gleaming, his gaze fixed on the lake city ahead. Behind him, hundreds of warriors followed, not Spaniards, but native allies, enemies of the empire, now marching under a foreign god. From the rooftops of Tenochtitlan, the Mexica watched in silence. Children gripped their mothers' hands. Merchants closed their stalls. Even the wind slowed, as if the lake itself held its breath. The great causeway stretched before them, 3 miles of stone across the shimmering lake. and at the far end, the city rose like a dream. White temples, twin towers, golden banners dancing in the wind. Montezuma stood waiting, not with an army, not with a sword, but with flowers, and incense, and trembling hands. He wore his finest cloak, a crown of jade, but his eyes were full of storm. As Cortez approached, the two men locked eyes. No words yet, only silence, heavy, final. The moment prophecy became reality. The gates of Tenochtitlan opened, not by force, not yet, but by belief. And as the strangers entered the sacred city, the people watched in fear and wonder, for gods had come, or monsters, or something worse. The lake shimmered like glass, and across its sacred waters, the strangers came, boots striking stone, metal flashing in the light, banners snapping like fire. On the eastern causeway, a long procession moved forward. Foreign soldiers, strange animals, thunderous weapons, and at the center a man named Hernán Cortés. He had never seen a city like this. Tenochtitlan rose from the lake like a vision. White temples kissed the sky. Gardens floated on the water. Markets buzzed with the pulse of 1,000 lives. It was not a city. It was an empire resting on reflections. Behind Cortés, his men whispered, "It looks like a dream. This is not savagery. This is civilization." But beneath that all lay hunger, for gold, for glory, for conquest. The Mexica stood along the edges of the causeway, silent. They did not cheer. They did not run. They simply watched, their faces painted, unreadable, as gods passed through their city. And then came Montezuma, the emperor of blood and stone, the high priest of 1,000 sacrifices. And yet, in that moment, a man trembling beneath the weight of prophecy. He stepped forward alone, clad in turquoise and gold, a crown of quetzal feathers rising behind him like a flame. When their eyes met, time slowed. One believed he was meeting a god, the other a man destined to fall. Montezuma bowed. Cortés extended his hand, and in the heart of the empire, two worlds touched for the first time. Gifts followed, flowers, incense, gold. Words were exchanged, flowery, cautious, veiled in metaphor. "You are weary," Montezuma said. "You have come to your home." The Spaniards were led through the city, through canals and bridges, past towering temples and feathered banners. The scent of copal and blossoms hung in the air. Children peeked from behind walls. Warriors gripped spears behind columns. The people did not know what to feel. Were these gods? Messengers? Demons? They did not cheer. They did not resist. They waited. Cortés and his men were given a palace, once belonging to Montezuma's father. Spacious, guarded, golden. They were not prisoners, but they were not free. They were being watched, just as they were watching in return. And in the stillness of that first night, as stars hung over the lake, both sides stared across the courtyard, eyes filled with questions. What had begun? What had been allowed? And what would be the cost? The sun rose over the waters of Lake Texcoco. Its light poured into the canals of Tenochtitlan, a city that floated, breathed, shimmered. For the Spaniards, it was a revelation. They had come expecting savages. Instead, they found splendor. Cortés walked the causeways with his captains. Stone streets beneath their boots, water on all sides, bridges drawn at night, canals teeming with canoes, temples towering above markets, and at the center of it all, order. "It is as grand as Seville," one whispered. "No," said another. Greater. They passed fountains of carved stone, gardens blooming atop rooftops, markets alive with color, language, rhythm. Thousands bartered and moved in harmony, each role defined, each step rehearsed over generations. They saw astronomers charting stars, healers working with herbs, children reciting glyphs in painted schools, and warriors eagle and jaguar watching from shadowed corners. But beneath the awe, there was calculation. Cortez wasn't just admiring, he was studying. He counted warriors, measured gates, watched the drawbridges, noted the weakness of water and the strength of stone. This city, he thought, could fall. Even something so divine had a spine, and spines could break. The Mexica, too, watched. They noticed how the strangers touched everything, how they spoke quickly, quietly, and looked far more than they smiled. Their weapons were always close, their horses restless, their armor never removed. At night, Montezuma sent food, dancers, flowers, and Cortez gave gifts in return, glass beads, mirrors, iron. But something was wrong. The laughter was thin, the silences longer. Even the gods in the temples seemed to lean forward, listening. Montezuma visited again, his eyes heavier, his voice slower. He asked if the strangers were content. Cortez smiled and nodded, but behind his eyes, thoughts turned like blades. This man is not a god, Cortez thought. He is afraid. The Spaniards prayed quietly in their chambers. They erected a small cross inside their palace. They whispered of opportunity, of gold, of glory. One wrote in his journal, "The city is noble, the people strange, but they can be broken." And still, no battle had begun. No sword drawn, no blood spilled, only smiles, only courtesy, the illusion of peace. But it was an illusion, a mask stretched thin, a heartbeat too calm, for behind every gesture, every gift, every glance, was a question neither side dared ask. How long can this last? It began with courtesy and ended with a cage. Montezuma had given them everything: a palace, feasts, dancers, gold, even silence where suspicion should have lived. And still it was not enough. Cortez knew the city was vast, the warriors many, the gods still feared, but fear could be weaponized, even against an empire. So he made his move, without shouting, without blood, just a conversation behind walls, just a gesture masked in respect. He summoned Montezuma to the Spaniards' quarters, not with chains, but with flowers and soft voices. The emperor obeyed. He walked through his own city, surrounded not by priests or warriors, but by iron men in silence. The people watched. They did not understand. Not yet. Inside the foreign palace, Cortez bowed. He smiled. He offered a seat. And then, gently, he told Montezuma that he must stay, for his own protection. It was not a demand, not a threat, but it left no room for refusal. "We fear for your safety," Cortez said. "There are plots, whispers. You will be safe with us." The lie was dressed in gold, but it was still a chain. Montezuma nodded. From that day forward, the emperor of the Mexica became a guest in his own city, a hostage behind stone walls. His voice still carried weight, but now it came with a Spanish echo. He gave orders, but under watch. He saw priests, but only with permission, and he prayed to gods who had already turned their backs. The people began to murmur. Why had the king not returned to the palace? Why did he walk only with the invaders? Why did the drums fall silent when he passed? But Montezuma said nothing. He bathed, he dressed, he offered gifts. Every day, he climbed to the top of the Spanish-held tower to speak to his people. "All is well," he said. "These are our honored guests." But his eyes had changed, and the people felt it. Meanwhile, Cortés solidified his grip. He sent messages, built alliances, began controlling tribute and temple rites. Gold flowed faster now, not as sacred offering, but as Spanish inventory. In corners of the city, rage began to simmer. Young warriors sharpened obsidian blades. Priests whispered old prophecies. And the name Montezuma no longer inspired awe, but confusion. The empire still breathed. The temples still rose above the lake. But the heart of the Mexica, their king, had been taken, not by war, not by force, but by fear and silence and the slow poison of surrender. Tenochtitlan still stood. His towers rose with quiet pride. His markets bustled. His canals glimmered with light. But something had changed. Not in the stones, not in the temples, in the people. Their emperor no longer ruled. He appeared, yes, from the balcony of the foreign palace. Surrounded by men in steel, he spoke gently, said what he had to. "Honor our guests. All is well. The gods watch over us." But his voice was hollow. Even the wind no longer carried it far. In the alleys and behind closed doors, the warriors spoke in whispers. Their blades were ready, their hearts burning, but the order to rise never came. Montezuma gave none, and without his word, no one moved. The Spaniards walked freely now. They counted temples, sketched bridges, weighed gold. At night they prayed to their god, while gold idols of other gods watched from the shadows. They were polite, careful, calculating, but they were not blind. They saw the stairs, felt the silence, heard the quiet drums returning in the distance. Then came the final insult. In Montezuma's name, under his forced signature, Cortés ordered the destruction of sacred idols. In temples that had stood for centuries, Spanish priests raised crosses, smeared lime over stone faces, burned offerings meant for gods far older than theirs. The priests of Huitzilopochtli wept in silence. The people said nothing, not yet, but their silence was not submission. It was thunder, coiled beneath stone. Montezuma watched it all. His hands, once stained with sacrificial blood, now trembled without command. He had dreamed of omens, flames, comets, shadows in the east. And now the omen lived in his palace. It drank his water, slept in his father's bed, wrote letters he could not read. Still he waited. He believed in fate, in prophecy, in the cycle of the sun. Perhaps this too was part of the story foretold. But among his people, patience had withered. The merchants no longer bowed at the palace gate. The warriors no longer chanted before sunrise. The women at the market spoke in sharp tones, their fear slowly giving way to fury. Even the children no longer played near the Spanish quarters. They stared, and then ran. One morning, a drummer played a forbidden rhythm, old, violent, a song meant for war. The Spaniards heard it. Cortés dismissed it, but Montezuma flinched. The silence was cracking. Soon it would break, and when it did, the city would burn, not from cannon, but from within, from the blood of gods and the betrayal of kings. The drums rose in joy. It was the festival of Tenochtitlan, one of the holiest days in the Mexica calendar. Music soared through the sacred courtyard. Dancers moved in perfect rhythm, their bodies painted in gold and obsidian. Priests sang praises to the gods. Flowers rained down like whispers from the heavens. There was no fear that morning, only reverence, only beauty. But behind the temple doors, Spanish eyes watched, eyes that did not understand, eyes that feared what they could not name. Pedro de Alvarado stood at the edge of the courtyard. In Cortez's absence, he held power, and in his heart paranoia. He saw warriors. He imagined blades. He feared a trap behind every song. So he struck first. The Spaniards closed the gates. The music did not stop until the swords came. Steel crashed into flesh. Dancers fell mid-step. Priests screamed in prayer, cut down beneath the very gods they served. Blood pooled across sacred stone. Feathers stained red. The rhythm turned to chaos. No one fought back. They had brought no weapons, only offerings. When it was over, the courtyard lay silent. Hundreds dead, the altar slick with blood. And something deeper had died with them. Trust. The Mexica would never forget this day, and they would never forgive it. First there was silence, a silence thicker than smoke. Then came the sound of drums, not the soft rhythm of ceremony, but the deep, furious beat of war. The Mexica had risen. News of the massacre at the Templo Mayor spread like fire. Fathers found their sons among the dead. Mothers wept, then sharpened blades. The city's breath changed. The lake stilled. Even the air felt heavier. The gods had been insulted. The blood had not been theirs to take. The people turned. Streets once calm became hunting grounds. Markets emptied. Bridges lifted. The causeways were sealed. The Spaniards were trapped. When Cortez returned from the coast, he entered a different city. The same temples, the same lake, but nothing felt familiar. No cheers, no flowers, no open gates, only eyes, watching, waiting. His men were rattled. Gold meant nothing now. Food was scarce. Allies vanished. Stones fell from rooftops. Spears glinted in alleyways. Every canal was a knife drawn in silence. Cortez tried to calm the city, tried to speak through Montezuma, tried to restore the illusion of control. But the illusion had died at Tenochtitlan. Now the city spoke through fire. Tenochtitlan, once the host, was now a cage, and the gods whispered from their temples, "Let the strangers bleed." He stood at the edge of the rooftop. The sun burned low over the lake. Below him, the city screamed. Stones flew through the air. Spears pierced the sky. Drums thundered like distant gods calling for war. And Montezuma, once divine, stood in silence. Cortez pushed him forward. "Speak to them," he urged. "Tell them to stop." So the emperor obeyed, wrapped in royal robes. Blood dried at the edge of his lips. His voice cracked from silence. He raised his hand. The warriors below hesitated. "My sons," Montezuma said, "there is no need for this." But the people did not bow. They did not cheer. They stared with rage in their eyes. He had become a stranger to them, a prisoner, a shadow of the god-king he once was. Someone shouted, "Coward!" A stone was thrown, then another, and another. The king of the Mexica, the chosen of Ahuitzotl, fell to his knees, blood on his face, a crack in his skull, silence in his heart. They carried him back inside. No rites, no chanting, no temple, just darkness. He died days later. Some said by his own people. Others whispered it was the Spaniards. It did not matter. The gods had turned away, and the city would now burn. The king was dead, and with him the last thread of peace. Now Tenochtitlan closed in. The bridges were raised. The causeways shattered. The canals bristled with obsidian blades. The city had become a maze of death, and the Spaniards were caged within it. Cortés stood at the palace walls, his men worn thin, armor dented, powder low, food nearly gone. Their native allies, once eager, now whispered of omens and begged to leave, but the lake offered no exit, and the people beyond the gates offered no mercy. Every hour, drums beat. Every day, missiles rained from rooftops. The air reeked of sweat and smoke. The dead were piling. Hope thinning. Still, Cortés refused to fall. He planned. He counted men, measured silence, prayed to a God who had led them this far, but no longer answered. Inside the broken palace, the Spaniards melted down gold, the very gold they had come for. Bars were cast, pockets filled. Even now, on the edge of death, they clung to their hunger. But outside, the Mexica sharpened their obsidian. They had lost their king, but not their pride, not their fury. The gods demanded balance, blood for blood, stone for steel, and the lake, once calm, now whispered of vengeance. The night was moonless. Clouds hung low over the lake, thick and silent like breath held too long. Tenochtitlan slept uneasily. The air was heavy with memory. Blood spilled in temples, gods defiled, a king murdered. The foreigners, still trapped inside the heart of the city, knew the end had come. They would not be allowed to stay, so they chose to run. It was the 1st of July, 1520, a date that would live forever in pain. Cortés gathered his broken army, his Spanish swordsmen, weary and hollow-eyed, his native allies, Tlaxcalans and others, frightened and unsure. They carried gold in bags, in armor, even inside their mouths. They had come for glory. Now they fled with guilt. They waited until midnight, the city silent, and then, like shadows, they slipped out of the palace. They moved in long, careful lines. Across the Tlacopan Causeway, one of the narrow bridges that connected the island to the mainland, they carried cannons wrapped in cloth, guns loaded, but voices held back, horses muzzled, boots padded. Every sound was fear. But the lake sees everything. So do the gods. And so did the Mexica warriors, watching from the darkness. Halfway across the causeway, a woman's scream pierced the stillness. Then drums, then horns, then fire. The Mexica struck with fury. From the water, canoes rose like ghosts. Arrows rained from the sky. Screams echoed across the lake. The causeway became a graveyard. The Spaniards panicked. Men slipped on blood. Horses crashed through the gaps. Gold dragged them down, into the lake, into the mud, into silence. They called it La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. For 100 Spaniards died. Thousands of native allies drowned. Even Cortés lost his sword, his pride, his men. He barely escaped. At dawn, he reached a tree on the far shore, and under that tree, his armor soaked, his hands empty, his dream broken, Hernán Cortés wept, not for the dead, not for the city, but for himself. The Aztec Empire had struck back, not with politics, not with gods, but with blood and memory. The empire had not yet fallen. It had survived the betrayal. It had defended its heart. But this was not the end. Cortés would return. And when he did, he would not come as a guest. He would come to destroy. The tree where Cortés wept still stood, its roots tangled in the earth, its branches bare, the silence sacred. But the man who knelt beneath it was no longer broken. He was reforged, in fire, in blood, in humiliation, and now he would return. After the disaster of La Noche Triste, Cortés limped back to Tlaxcala, the bitter enemy of the Mexica. His army was shattered, his pride in ruins, but his resolve had hardened into iron. He was not done. In Tlaxcala he found refuge, his wounded treated, his dead mourned, and yet, while others prayed for peace, Cortés prepared for war. He sent word across the valleys. "Join me," he promised. "Join me and you will see Tenochtitlan fall." And they came, tens of thousands, from Texcoco, Tlaxcala, Chalco, Huexinco, cities that had long bent the knee to the Mexica, cities that had paid in children, in blood, in tribute. Now they saw their chance to rise. Cortés was no longer just a Spaniard. He was the weapon of their revenge. Then he did something the Mexica could not foresee. He built ships, on land. In the dry highlands, far from any shore, Cortés and his men carved the hulls of 13 brigantines, small warships with sails and cannon. They dragged them piece by piece, over hills and fields, to the edge of Lake Texcoco. There, with native hands and Spanish minds, they assembled a navy. While the Mexica sharpened obsidian, Cortés prepared iron. While they prayed to the gods, he plotted their destruction. In April 1521, the ships set sail on the lake. Winds filled their sails. Cannonballs lined their decks. They moved like shadows of the apocalypse, foreign, floating, silent. No canoe could match them. No warrior could board them. The water now belonged to Spain. But Cortés was not finished. He split his army into 3 columns, each assigned to one of the causeways: Tlacopan, Iztapalapa, Tepeac. They would surround the city, cut off every bridge, destroy every aqueduct, starve it. No mercy, no passage, no escape. The siege had begun, and this time Cortés would not be gentle. He would burn the city if he had to, brick by brick, temple by temple. Inside Tenochtitlan, the Mexica watched the lake change. No longer blue, now streaked with sails and steel. Their gods had warned of strangers from the sea. Now those strangers ruled the water. But they did not kneel. Not yet. The drums still beat. The warriors still gathered. And at their head stood a new king. Young, fierce, unyielding. Cuauhtémoc, the eagle that descends. He would fight not for tribute, but for survival. Not for glory, but for the soul of his people. 2 empires, 2 gods, 2 destinies. Both could not survive. Tenochtitlan, jewel of the lake, was surrounded. 3 causeways, 13 warships, thousands of warriors closing in from every side. And above them all, a silence deeper than fear. The siege had begun. Cortés tightened the noose. Each day his forces inched forward. Each night they pulled back the Mexica defenses, stone by stone, gate by gate. On the water, his brigantines ruled like beasts. Their cannons roared across the lake, shattering canoes, temples, towers. The Mexica had never faced such war. Not from this angle, not with this fury. But they would not bow. Not yet. Inside the city, Emperor Cuauhtémoc stood defiant. Young, sharp-eyed, hardened by loss. He had watched Montezuma die. He had seen the priests weep before silent gods. Now, he was the last shield between his people and extinction. And he would not break. They tore down bridges to trap the invaders. They rebuilt walls by night. They fought knee-deep in canals, on rooftops, inside burning temples. Children carried spears. Women sharpened obsidian. Priests climbed the temple steps to pray, but no answers came. The gods were silent. The sky, indifferent. Only the drums spoke now, and they beat louder with each passing day. Then came the hunger. The lake, once generous, was now poisoned with blood and rotting corpses. The crops had burned. The chinampas sank. Disease crept in like smoke, invisible, slow, merciless. Smallpox. It spread faster than steel, faster than fire. It devoured the young first, then the old, then the warriors. The streets filled with bodies, too many to bury, too sacred to burn. The temples overflowed with prayers, but there were no answers. Only fire in the distance, only smoke rising from the edge of the lake. Still they fought, from shattered rooftops, from floating barricades, from behind altars soaked in blood. For every stone Cortez took, 100 Mexica arrows flew. For every temple he leveled, another was defended with teeth and bone. This was not conquest. This was annihilation. The Spanish pushed forward, day by day, destroying entire districts. They brought fire to libraries, shattered icons, slaughtered those who begged for water. And still, Cuauhtémoc refused to flee. His people watched him from behind broken walls, and they believed, if he stands, we stand. But inside their eyes, something was fading. Not courage, not pride, but hope. By the end of the second month, Tenochtitlan no longer looked like a city. It was a skeleton of ash and stone, its beauty buried under blackened rubble, its lakeside shimmer gone, its heartbeat slowing. Yet even in ruin, it fought back. This was no ordinary capital. This was a holy place, a living prophecy, the center of the world, and it would not fall quietly. In the Spanish camp, men began to whisper, "The city cannot be killed. It is cursed." But Cortez knew better, could bleed, and anything that bleeds can die. Tenochtitlan was burning. Smoke choked the sky. Ash fell like dark snow on the shattered causeways. The lake, once a mirror to the heavens, now reflected only fire. The city, the heart of the empire, was dying. For months, the siege had strangled life out of the island. Food was gone. Water turned foul. Disease spread through crowded homes. Children wailed. Mothers wept. Every street became a battlefield. The Spaniards and their allies pushed forward. Obsidian blades clashed against steel. Temples, palaces, and homes became tombs. The cries of the dying echoed beneath the broken sun. But the Mexica did not surrender. They fought with desperation, with fury, with the strength of those who have lost everything but their pride. Warriors took to rooftops, hurling stones and arrows. They ambushed in alleyways, their shadows flickering like ghosts. Cuauhtémoc, the young emperor, led from the front. His eyes burned with defiance. His heart carried the weight of a fallen dynasty. In the great temple, priests continued rituals, offering what little they had left to the gods. Blood flowed still, a river of defiance against the coming end. But the city was unraveling. Fire consumed neighborhoods. The sound of splintering wood and collapsing stone filled the air. The once mighty aqueducts lay broken, cut off by the invaders to starve the city. The Mexica watched as their world crumbled. The end came swiftly. In the streets near the Templo Mayor, the final battles raged. Warriors fought to their last breath. Families hid beneath rubble. The silence of death was everywhere. Cuauhtémoc was captured, not in battle, but betrayed by exhaustion and hunger. The empire was no more. Tenochtitlan, once a jewel of the New World, was reduced to ashes and tears. And over its ruins, the Spanish raised a new city, one built not on gods, but on conquest. The Aztec Empire had fallen, but its spirit would live on. Cuauhtémoc stood tall, though his body was battered. The weight of an empire's last breath rested on his shoulders. Around him, the ruins of Tenochtitlan whispered stories of glory, loss, and shattered dreams. The young emperor had led his people through fire and blood. He had fought with the heart of an eagle, fierce, unyielding, proud. But even the bravest can be broken, captured not in the heat of battle, but by exhaustion and betrayal. Cuauhtémoc was dragged from his city's ruins. His hands bound, his spirit bruised. His people watched, some with tears, others with silent anger. He looked at Hernán Cortés with eyes that held both fire and sorrow, the conqueror who had destroyed the world he knew. But even in defeat, Cuauhtémoc did not bow. "I am still the eagle," he said softly, "though my wings are broken." Cortés saw in the captive emperor a symbol, not just of a fallen foe, but of a kingdom that would never truly die. The Spaniards marched out of the city, victorious but haunted. They carried gold, trophies, and prisoners, but the spirit of Tenochtitlan lingered like smoke. Cuauhtémoc was taken on a journey, through lands far from his lake city, tried and tested, always watched. His people whispered stories of his courage, his last stand, and the eagle that refused to fall. He became a symbol, a legend, a ghost in the pages of history. The Aztec Empire was gone, but its echoes shaped the future of a continent. The stones of Tenochtitlan would become the foundations of Mexico City. The blood spilled in its streets would fuel centuries of resistance. The gods might have fallen silent, but their stories and their people endured. Cuauhtémoc's legacy was not just in death, but in survival. The eagle may have fallen, but its flight still carries hope. The sun hung low over the valley. Its light faded like a dying ember. The great city of Tenochtitlan was no more. His heart had stopped beating. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, was a shadow of the fierce eagle he once was. His body bore scars of battle, his eyes heavy with the weight of a fallen world. Captured by the very men who destroyed his empire, he now walked a path of humiliation and suffering. They called him the eagle who descended, a king destined to protect his people until the very end. But destiny had been cruel. Hernán Cortés, the man who had toppled gods and kings, held Cuauhtémoc prisoner, not out of mercy, but out of fear. Fear that the eagle might still soar. Fear that the spirit of the Aztecs might rise again. In chains, Cuauhtémoc was paraded through the conquered lands. His people watched, their hearts breaking in silence. Their king, once a symbol of hope and power, now a captive, his crown replaced with shackles. But even in chains, Cuauhtémoc carried himself with dignity. He never bowed his head, never begged for mercy. His spirit burned brighter than ever, a flicker of resistance in the darkest night. Yet his fate was sealed. Cortés saw him as a threat, not just a prisoner, but a symbol, a spark that could ignite rebellion among the broken peoples. So the conquistadors decided to end the last flicker of Aztec power. On a cold day in 1525, far from the shining lakes and temples, Cuauhtémoc was tortured. The pain was meant to break his will, to crush the eagle forever. He endured, with stoic silence, with unyielding courage. His death was both a brutal act and a tragic sacrifice. A king who fought to the last breath, dying not as a defeated man, but as a symbol of resistance against overwhelming darkness. The news of his death spread quietly. Among the survivors, it was a wound that would never heal. the last echo of an empire fading into memory. But even as the emperor's body was claimed by the earth, his spirit lived on, in stories whispered in shadows, in the hearts of those who refused to forget. The Aztec Empire was gone, its stones scattered, its temples silent. But the eagle's flight was not over. The sun rose over the shattered lakes. Where once stood the great city of Tenochtitlan, only ruins remained, smoke curling from broken temples, waters darkened by blood and ash. The Spanish conquistadors moved swiftly. They claimed the land with iron and fire, but also with vision, a vision of a new city, a city to replace what had been lost. Mexico City was born not from peace, but from conquest. Stone by stone, ruin by ruin, the old Aztec capital was erased, and a new capital was forced into being. The conquistadors tore down sacred pyramids, toppled idols, and filled canals with rubble. They built over the bones of the fallen. Churches rose where temples once stood. Crosses replaced the gods of old. Yet, beneath the surface, the heart of the city beat on. The streets traced the memory of the ancient city. The lake's shimmering edge still embraced its islands, and the pulse of a people refused to die. Spanish settlers brought their language, law, and religion, but they could not fully erase the past. Aztec markets, traditions, and even the Nahuatl tongue survived in whispered conversations, in hidden rituals, in the souls of the descendants. Mexico City became a city of contradictions, where cathedrals cast shadows on ancient stones, and new rulers walked paths once tread by emperors. The city was a crucible where two worlds clashed, where pain and hope coexisted. For the indigenous peoples, this was not just loss. It was survival, a story rewritten, but never forgotten. The ruins of Tenochtitlan became the foundation of a new culture, one that blended blood and faith, stone and spirit. This city would rise to become the heart of New Spain, the center of power in the Americas, and centuries later, the capital of Mexico. And through its streets, the echoes of the Aztec Empire still whispered, reminders of a past both tragic and triumphant. The birth of Mexico City marked the end of one empire and the complicated beginning of another. The empire had fallen, its stones scattered like dust in the wind. Temples lay broken, kings were dead, but the spirit, the soul of the Aztecs was far from gone. In the shadows of Mexico City's soaring cathedrals, in the quiet corners of villages and markets, the ancient ways persisted. Language survived. Nahuatl words whispered between families, passed from elders to children, a secret thread tying generations. Faith adapted. Though the great gods no longer ruled openly, their stories lived on, masked beneath new symbols, woven into Christian saints and rituals. Humanity's resilience is a river, finding new paths when blocked. So too did the Aztec people flow around the walls of conquest. Songs once sung in temple courts echoed now in hidden homes. Dances meant to honor Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc were performed in secret, their meanings veiled in shadows. Art transformed. Featherwork and sculpture mingled with European styles, creating something new, something neither conqueror nor conquered could fully claim. The markets thrived. Merchants and farmers carried on ancient trades, selling maize, cacao, pottery, and cloth. Life pulsed stubbornly beneath the colonial order. Rebellion flickered. Small uprisings, whispered plots, and acts of defiance kept hope alive. Though broken, the Aztec spirit refused to submit. For many, survival was not just endurance, but an act of resistance. The blending of cultures formed a new identity, one forged in fire and blood, in loss and love, in sorrow and strength. This mestizo world bore the scars of empire, but also the promise of rebirth. Centuries later, the descendants of the Aztecs would reclaim their history and heritage, not as relics of a lost world, but as living threads in the fabric of modern Mexico. The Aztec Empire's shadow stretched far beyond its fall, in language, religion, art, and spirit. They were not erased. They endured. The sun sets over modern Mexico City, a sprawling metropolis built upon ancient bones. Beneath its streets lie the remnants of Tenochtitlan, stones of temples, echoes of a civilization that once ruled the lake. The Aztec Empire is gone, its kings long dead, its gods silenced beneath crosses, but its spirit, unyielding, remains alive. In the streets, markets, and festivals, fragments of Aztec culture still pulse. Traditional dances echo the movements of ancient warriors. The Nahuatl language, though spoken by fewer now, still carries the weight of centuries. Art and architecture borrow from Aztec symbols, the serpent, the eagle, the sun. They remind a proud people of their roots, of a time when their ancestors shaped the destiny of the Americas. Mexican identity is a tapestry, woven from the threads of conquest and survival, of pain and resilience. The Aztec legacy is its core. The stories of Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma, and the great builders are taught in schools, told in homes, and sung in songs. They inspire a sense of pride and belonging, a connection to a past both glorious and tragic. The empire's fall was not the end. It was a beginning, a reminder that history is never truly lost, that memory can outlive empires. Aztec heritage lives in the hearts of millions, in festivals like Dia de los Muertos, where ancient and modern beliefs blend, in the cuisine, rich with corn, chili, and cacao, gifts from the old world, in the resilience of a people who survived annihilation and adapted. The legacy is complex. It is a story of conquest and colonization, but also of endurance and transformation. Today, Mexico stands as a bridge between past and present, a land where the eagle still perches on a cactus, symbolizing strength and hope. The Aztec Empire's echoes shape art, culture, politics, and identity, reminding the world that even in ashes, greatness can be reborn. The story of the Aztecs is not just history. It is a living legacy, a flame passed down through generations, burning bright in the heart of a nation. The empire may have fallen, but its spirit soars, forever part of Mexico's soul.